There is a truth most men never hear, a sequence of instructions left unspoken, buried beneath the illusions of comfort, tradition, and empty affection. Your father, like all men bound by the weakness of his own survival, handed you fragments of guidance, the polite rules of society, the easy prescriptions of safety, the hollow endorsements of obedience. What he never told you, what he could not tell you, was this: the world does not honor virtue, it devours it. Power does not answer to fairness, nor does respect rise from decency alone. It emerges from strategy, perception, and the unwavering control of your own identity. Consider the man who speaks as if guidance is merely the repetition of inherited morals. He has never seen the subtle theater of dominance, the invisible ledger where human value is tallied. He has never understood that the absence of fear in others is a reflection of your own weakness, that every slight, every whispered betrayal, every moment of disregard is an opportunity to recalibrate the balance of power. Your father may have told you to be honest, to be kind, to be patient, but he failed to reveal the one law that governs all human interaction: perception is currency, and influence is the tool that converts it. The advice he withheld was not cruel, it was necessary. He could not teach you that the world recognizes only one truth: those who control the narrative of themselves, and others will always command the field. Your ego, left untrained, becomes a liability. Your trust, given too freely, becomes a weapon against you. Every relationship, every transaction, every casual encounter is a battlefield disguised as routine life. And yet, you have been handed a set of instructions designed to make you a victim of your own good intentions. To understand what should have been said is to confront the subtle machinery of human behavior. Silence is never empty, it is a tool of influence. Withdrawal is never weakness, it is a signal that you are no longer available for exploitation. Every human desire, envy, lust, admiration, anger, is predictable, and every predictable impulse can be leveraged if you learn to observe without attachment, to act without emotion, and to measure the impact of each choice on the perception others hold of you. Your father's absence of instruction is, in truth, the first lesson the world will teach you, often through humiliation, what he would not. Imagine the stages of your life as a series of psychological chambers, each designed to test the control of your ego. In one room, your ambition will be questioned. In another, your identity will fracture under the weight of expectation and envy. In another, trust will be wielded as a weapon against you. The lessons you missed were never about morality. They were about dominance. They were about understanding that human beings, without exception, act in accordance with self-interest, and that your failure to recognize this is what leaves you vulnerable. The advice your father should have given you was not a roadmap to comfort. It was an architecture of vigilance. It would have instructed you to observe first, to measure before you act, to value absence over presence when leverage demands it, to cultivate a calm detachment that masks intent and magnifies influence. It would have warned you that power resides not in loud declaration or in reactive emotion, but in the deliberate orchestration of perception. That mastery of your own mind precedes mastery over others. That patience, when used strategically, becomes a weapon sharper than any sword. And so, the silence of paternal instruction becomes a mirror. What you were denied is precisely what the world will demand of you. Every slight, every dismissal, every unseen maneuver will reveal the inadequacy of conventional advice. To survive, to command, to dominate without cruelty, you must internalize lessons that were never spoken. The calculation of influence, the control of desire, the architecture of ego. You must learn what he could not teach, and in learning it, you will see that all other advice, virtue, kindness, diligence is secondary. The real inheritance is mastery over perception, over self, over the unseen currents that define every interaction you will ever face. This is the counsel never given, the roadmap to influence, to control, to unseen dominance. The advice your father should have given you is not easy. It is precise. It is merciless. And it begins here, with the cold acknowledgement that the world does not care for what is moral, it only respects what is effective. And you, now aware of the void between instruction and reality, must decide, Will you be shaped by absence, or will you seize the knowledge he never offered and forge a mind that bends the world to its will? The first betrayal is never inflicted by others. It is self-inflicted through your own blind surrender to how you are seen. You measure your worth by the reflection in their eyes, by the fleeting nods of approval, by the invisible ledger of admiration that the world arbitrarily assigns. This is the beginning of obsession, the relentless fixation on perception that corrupts judgment, fractures ego, and renders you a pawn in a game you cannot yet comprehend. Every interaction becomes a trial of image rather than substance. Every word you speak, every gesture you make, is weighed for its resonance, its capacity to elicit influence or scorn. And while the world watches with indifference, your mind flails, calculating, replaying, anticipating. The most dangerous weakness lies not in error, but in anticipation of judgment, because it erodes the authority of your own decisions before they are even enacted. Here, control slips through the fingers of those who confuse being seen with being respected. Machiavelli understood this instinctively. The governed fear weakness more than cruelty. The observer admires decisiveness more than kindness. Your value, once defined by external validation, becomes hostage to the caprices of others. Every slight, every glance of dismissal, fuels a quiet rage, a compulsive need to be recognized, to be understood, to be validated. Obsession with perception is the first trap of human ambition. It binds the mind to reactive patterns, to a servitude disguised as attention. The lesson never spoken by your father is this: dominance begins in the absence of dependence on perception. You must learn to command attention without craving it, to manipulate presence without revealing desire, to hold sway over observation while remaining untouched by it. The mind that obsesses becomes a landscape of mirrors, each reflecting a distorted fragment of reality. The strategist knows that to influence, to control, one must first dissolve the tyranny of external reflection, replacing it with the absolute authority of internal perception. And so the first stage unfolds awareness of your obsession, recognition of its cost, and the choice to redirect it. Observation becomes a weapon. Silence becomes leverage. Detachment becomes the forge upon which influence is tempered. Only when you renounce the need for approval does the machinery of power begin to align. And the first true step toward self-mastery is taken. Trust is a currency most men squander carelessly. You give it freely, as if innocence or loyalty confers safety, as if human beings act in accordance with principle rather than self-interest. In this stage, the mind begins to perceive the inevitability of betrayal. Every word spoken in confidence, every promise once believed, becomes a test of your discernment, a measure of the fragility of human allegiance. The world does not reward sincerity, it exploits it. The erosion of trust begins subtly. A glance lingers too long, a tone betrays a hidden agenda, and the mind, once untrained, reacts with fear, with frustration, with impulsive retaliation. The ego collapses incrementally under the weight of disillusionment. You begin to notice patterns, how desire shapes action, how weakness invites manipulation, how every human interaction carries the shadow of exploitation. Here, the strategist recognizes a fundamental truth. Relationships are instruments, not sanctuaries. Every person you meet is a potential vector of influence, and every promise they make is an opportunity for recalibration. This stage is psychologically corrosive. Obsession over perception now merges with suspicion over loyalty. The mind becomes a labyrinth of contingencies, each exit blocked by the potential for deception. Emotional reactions are liabilities, attachment is a vulnerability. Machiavellian reasoning dictates that one must measure value, anticipate subterfuge, and neutralize the unexpected. Trust, then, is no longer a given, it is a calculated tool. To extend it is to wield it strategically, never emotionally. In this crucible, the human ego learns to armor itself. Silence becomes a shield, absence becomes leverage. The strategist observes without revealing intent, calculates without declaring motive, and manipulates expectations so that others act according to your design, unaware of the architecture guiding their choices. What your father should have taught you is this: the world will betray you, not out of malice, but out of natural law. The law of self-interest governs all interactions, and the uninitiated pay the price for ignoring it. The erosion of trust is the gateway to autonomy. Awareness of betrayal transforms vulnerability into authority, disappointment into strategy. By learning the patterns of human duplicity, the mind is sharpened, the ego fortified, and the foundations of influence, built on observation, restraint, and calculated engagement, are laid. Only by embracing this bitter calculus does one move beyond naive expectation and enter the domain of true psychological control. The ego is the first casualty of mastery. Once inflated by external validation and untested pride, it begins to fracture under the pressure of observation, betrayal, and the relentless calculus of human behavior. The collapse is neither sudden nor dramatic. It is a quiet erosion, a subtle undermining of self-importance that leaves the mind exposed to truths it once denied. You realize, often too late, that your identity was built on reflection rather than substance, that admiration was mistaken for influence, and that power is never granted, it is seized. In this stage, emotional impulses reveal their weakness. Anger, pride, attachment, these are tools of the untrained mind, levers easily manipulated by those who understand human frailty. The strategist, by contrast, observes the collapse with a measured detachment. Each crack in the ego is a doorway, an opportunity to rebuild not in accordance with desire, but in accordance with control. The world tests the boundaries of your self-perception, and in every test lies the lesson your father failed to deliver. Authority begins within. Ego collapse forces the mind to confront its illusions. Identity, once rigid and reactive, must become fluid and deliberate. You learn to disassociate value from acknowledgement, to measure success by the precision of your actions rather than the applause of spectators. Silence becomes not emptiness, but strategy. Absence is no longer a vulnerability, but a lever of influence. Every decision is weighed against the architecture of perception, every interaction evaluated for its contribution to unseen authority. Machiavelli would recognize this as the crucible of true power, a mind unshackled from the need for validation, refined through adversity, and tempered by observation. The collapse of ego is not defeat, it is transformation. It is the shedding of weakness, the recalibration of desire, the moment when the strategist's mind learns to operate above emotion and beneath the radar of expectation. By the end of this stage, the individual no longer reacts. They calculate, they observe, they control. The collapse of ego is the birth of internal authority, a quiet, insidious dominion over the self that precedes dominion over the world. Here, the first true mastery emerges, not over others, but over the unseen chains that once dictated thought, feeling, and action. Fear is the silent architect of the mind, shaping decisions, bending perception, and unraveling the threads of identity. It is neither dramatic nor announced. It creeps in through hesitation, uncertainty, and the relentless awareness of one's own vulnerability. At this stage, the individual confronts the uncomfortable truth. The self is not a single, unbroken entity. It is a network of impulses, desires, and constructed facades, each capable of betrayal. The fracture of identity is not an accident. It is a necessary passage towards psychological sovereignty. Every human interaction now becomes a test of control over fear, obsession, regret, envy. These are the chains others attempt to bind you with, subtle manipulations designed to collapse your autonomy. The mind begins to internalize tension, to anticipate threats, to weigh each potential action against both consequence and perception. In this crucible, anxiety becomes a tool, not a weakness. Fear, when observed with detachment, is converted into a lens through which influence is magnified, and every hesitation becomes a strategic pause rather than a liability. Machiavellian thinking thrives here. The fractured self is no longer vulnerable, but adaptable. By recognizing the multiple layers of identity, ego, persona, hidden desire, you gain the ability to manipulate both your internal responses and the reactions of others. The fractured self becomes a weapon, an instrument of unpredictability that prevents others from fully mapping your intent. Control is no longer projected outward through overt dominance. It is exercised inwardly, through command of tension, restraint, and the careful modulation of presence. This stage is psychologically demanding. The mind must endure discomfort, confront internal contradictions, and accept the impermanence of the self it once clung to. Yet in this fracture lies power. The individual learns to inhabit multiple planes of identity, to navigate perception without attachment, and to wield fear as a catalyst rather than a cage. The strategist emerges from this trial not stronger in arrogance, but stronger in composure, calculating in silence, and capable of bending the will of those who mistake human predictability for weakness. By the end of this stage, fear no longer rules, it informs. The fractured self becomes a fortress, each fragment a calculated instrument, each pause a measure of control. And in the shadows of tension, the first seeds of absolute psychological authority take root. Desire is the engine of human behavior, the hidden force driving choices, alliances, and betrayals. To the untrained mind, it appears uncontrollable, chaotic, and personal. To the strategist, it is a map, a lever, and a weapon. In this stage, you learn to observe desire in others with surgical precision, to measure its strength, to anticipate its path, and to bend it without confrontation. Influence is no longer about coercion, it becomes an art of orchestration, subtle, invisible, and absolute. Every longing, ambition, lust, admiration, fear is predictable when stripped of illusion. People act to fulfill their cravings, unaware of the architecture guiding them. The strategist positions themselves at the center of this web, calculating which thread to tug and when. Silence, absence, and restraint are the instruments of persuasion. A pause is interpreted as contemplation, a refusal as strength, a measured smile as reassurance. Desire, when manipulated subtly, becomes obedience without awareness, allegiance without loyalty, and power without visibility. At this stage, the mind itself becomes an instrument. You must recognize your own latent desires, control their expression, and prevent them from revealing weakness. Emotional transparency is vulnerability. Calculation is dominance. Machiavellian precision dictates that every action serves a dual purpose. It satisfies necessity while amplifying perception. The strategist does not act for gratification, he acts to shape the landscape of influence, converting longing into leverage and impulsivity into control. The orchestration of desire is also a mirror. By mastering it in others, you reflect mastery over self. Every temptation resisted, every impulse restrained, reinforces authority within. Every observation of human craving strengthens foresight and fortifies patience. In this quiet manipulation, the world reveals its truth's influence resides not in force, but in subtlety. Control is exercised not through reaction, but through anticipation, and power is defined not by dominance alone, but by the invisible sway over the choices of others. By the conclusion of this stage, the individual is no longer reactive to desire, they are its architect. Observation transforms into orchestration, silence becomes leverage, presence becomes command, and through the manipulation of desire, the strategist ascends from participant to director, from prey to unseen authority, poised to conclude the final stage of psychological sovereignty. At last, the architecture of the mind stands unbroken, tempered by observation, betrayal, and the quiet mastery of influence. The lessons your father failed to impart have been internalized through struggle, calculation, and the relentless shaping of perception. Here, in the cold aftermath of obsession, ego collapse, fear and desire, a final truth emerges. Power resides not in the world, but in the mind that refuses to be moved by it. Human nature is indifferent, ruthless, and predictable. Every gesture of kindness masks self-interest. Every display of loyalty contains the seeds of betrayal. Every declaration of morality conceals a hunger for advantage. The strategist sees this clearly and, in seeing it, transcends it. Influence becomes an extension of presence, authority a consequence of detachment, and control the natural outcome of self-mastery. Others act according to their desires, fears, and misconceptions, but the mind that rules itself manipulates all outcomes without the need for force. Emotional dominance is the final weapon. Silence commands more than words. Absence shapes behavior more than presence. Detachment communicates more than disclosure. To master the self is to occupy a domain untouched by the whims, judgments, and impulses of others. The strategist becomes a constant, an unseen force, a pivot around which human expectation bends. The world may attempt to sway, to diminish, to provoke, but it encounters only composure, calculation, and unassailable authority. The haunting lesson is this: morality and virtue are illusions for the untrained. Only through understanding human weakness, controlling internal chaos, and orchestrating perception can one achieve true mastery. The advice your father should have given was never about doing good or seeking approval. It was about survival, influence, and sovereignty. The mind that internalizes this counsel becomes untouchable, commanding respect without demanding it, shaping reality without assertion, and moving through the currents of human behavior like a silent dominion. In the end, the world obeys only those who obey themselves. The strategist's dominion is invisible but absolute, and the truth, cruel and magnificent, remains. Mastery is not granted, it is seized, forged in silence, and maintained through the relentless command of mind over self, perception over reaction, and presence over desire. To reach this state is not to triumph over others, it is to triumph over the chaos within, to become the final authority in a world that respects only power, control, and the unshakable sovereignty of self.